Great. So like it says here on the slide, I'm here to talk about 4 different ways that you can go and do some interesting research. I have a little bit of experience with all 4, but before I get to that, I first want to talk a little bit about medieval history.
Okay.
There we go. Okay, so who here knows what a guild was?
Guild.
Guild. What's a guild? Yeah.
I know what a guild is, but it doesn't know. That doesn't mean I can explain it.
Okay, yeah. So guilds were like trade associations, sort of. If you wanted to be a mason, you had to join the Masons Guild. If you wanted to be a weaver, you had to join the Weavers Guild, and so on. And as time went on, these guilds got very, very powerful. People who were leaders of guilds had all kinds of important roles in running cities, and they had ritual roles and various civic occasions, and they performed a very important economic gatekeeping and credentialing function. If you needed some kind of job done, you would just ask the guild to do the job, and they would send somebody, and you would have confidence that that person knew what they were doing. And as I said, these guilds got really to be a very, very big deal over time. And the way it worked to join a guild, let's say that you were a young man who had always dreamed of being a silversmith. Like, you would go and become what was called an apprentice in the silversmith's guild. And as an apprentice, you're just doing super menial jobs, boring stuff, right? As an apprentice silversmith, you're like cleaning ashes out of the furnace every day. But you're also going out on jobs with more senior members of the guild, and you're watching them work, and you're learning from what they're doing. And you're learning by doing a little bit also yourself. And as time goes on, you get better and better at your job. And after a period of time, which was usually somewhere between 5 and 9 years, you would take basically an exam. And if you passed, your apprenticeship would end, and you were now a journeyman of the guild. And a journeyman was sort of like the sort of full-fledged member. A journeyman is somebody who would get sent out by the guild to do jobs on behalf of the guild for all their various customers. And the most important and interesting thing about journeymen, though, is when you reach this rank, you would normally leave your home city and you would go to a new city and you would join a new outpost of the same guild in that new city. And what this meant is that they served a very important economic role in disseminating knowledge. Because if there were any particular techniques or practices that had been developed by the guild in your home city, you were now spreading that elsewhere. This also encouraged standardization of techniques and standardization of practices for the same reason, which was really important in the economic development of the Middle Ages. So you'd spend a while being a journeyman, and then if you were really ambitious, after maybe a few decades, you could try to become a master of the guild. And in order to become a master, you had to produce a masterpiece. This is a real masterpiece produced by a journeyman of the Silversmiths Guild of Frisia in the 14th century. Basically, what a masterpiece was, is it was one work of art or architecture or craft or whatever, depending on your guild. And it was meant to show off that you had learned everything that the guild could possibly teach you, and that you had mastered every technique that was in use at this guild. And it also required you to do one more thing, which is you had to have at least one new technique in your masterpiece. And this, it was a little bit like a dissertation, right? It was your first original contribution giving back to the pool of human knowledge and showing that you were moving the entire field forward. And once you produced a masterpiece, if it was judged by the other guild masters to be good enough, you would become a master yourself, and then your life was awesome. Guild masters were really important people. They took on an important role in educating the next generation of guild members, but they also had tremendous freedom. They could basically work on anything they wanted, take any job they wanted. They, as I said, often took on important governance roles in the cities that they lived in. They were a really big deal. Okay, so let's talk about some of the pros and cons of belonging to a guild. On the plus side, you have quality control, right? Both in the sense that if you are a customer of the guild, you know that they're going to send somebody good to do the work. And also, as somebody joining the guild, you know that you're going to get taught by somebody good who knows what they're doing. You also have a clearly understandable career trajectory. I just explained it all to you. It was basically the same in every guild. So if you know that this is what you want to do, you have an exact idea of what the steps are and kind of how long each one takes and what it will look like when you get to the end. That's actually, that's a big deal. That's really good. You also get economic security, right? Another thing that guilds did back in the Middle Ages was, in addition to being like trade associations, they also acted a little bit like modern day labor unions. They would lobby on behalf of the economic interests of their members. And when they got work, they would make sure to allocate it in such a way that all of their members got at least some work. So nobody would ever go hungry. In the Middle Ages, that's a pretty big deal. That's pretty good. And then you get to wear cool outfits, right? And this is a bit of a synecdoche for having legible social status, but like this is a real thing. If you were a guild master, you'd wear a super cool outfit. Nobody else is allowed to wear those clothes. And when you went around your day and walked around the city, everybody would know that you're a guild master, and that means you're a big deal. That's nice. There's also some downsides to belonging to a guild. One is that you have to spend years doing what other people say, right? Your apprenticeship, this is especially true. Like if you're an apprentice mason, you're basically just carrying bricks around construction sites all day. That's not very fun. Even when you get to be a journeyman, you are still being sent by the guild to do work on its behalf, and you don't get any choice about what you're doing. Even when you get to be a master, you have to follow certain conventions, because by the time you reach this rank, everything you do now reflects on the guild. And you've spent decades of your life at this point devoted to this institution. So you want to be very, very careful that you don't embarrass it or make it look bad or anything. And it's true that you have a lot of artistic freedom and a lot of freedom of what techniques you apply on particular jobs, but you've been trained for decades by this institution that does things a particular way. And this process really selects for people who want to do what that institution says. So this freedom is maybe actually a little bit virtual. And you do have to engage in politics. As I said, these guilds got very, very powerful. Anytime something gets powerful, politics comes into it. It would be nice if these were totally meritocratic institutions, but they weren't. So as you've all probably guessed by now, you belong to a guild. If you have been wondering why it is that academics on important occasions process in these cool robes, carrying ceremonial maces, anybody? It's literally because guild masters used to process in the exact same outfits, carrying ceremonial maces. There's a direct one-to-one correspondence, right? Academia is a scholars guild. That is its historical origin. That is its present day function. It's not the only guild today, right? The American Medical Association is a guild for doctors. The American Bar Association is a guild for lawyers. Guilds are great. Guilds recur everywhere because they're a highly adaptive social structure. We see them in all time periods, and we see them in all different cultures as well. They recur again and again because they serve a useful function. Guilds are good. So what I now want to tell you about is much less well known. If you were a young man of, let's say, mathematical or mechanical or intellectual inclination in the Middle Ages, there was actually another career path open to you that had nothing to do with guilds. And it's much less well known. And it came about because of a very specific interaction of economic and social forces. The basic and economic problem was this. This was the super weapon of the early Middle Ages. A castle defended by competent people with a good source of drinking water inside it could hold out against determined attackers for a very, very long time. And it could also project power across the surrounding countryside for a very long way. The problem is that the social and political elites of the Middle Ages were these guys. In order to afford all that armor and the training to use that armor and the horse and etc., you had to be phenomenally wealthy. So this is the way that the elites of the Middle Ages fought. The problem is that while these guys were very difficult to defeat on an open battlefield, at least, until the invention of the longbow, they were very bad at taking these castles. Because in order to take a castle, you needed these guys, right? You needed ballistae and mangonels and trebuchets and guys who know how to dig under the walls and put dynamite there, and guys who know how to poison the town's water supply, and guys who know how to catapult plague victims over the walls, and all these like tricks. But that was considered a somewhat dishonorable or ungentlemanly style of warfare. And so any true aristocrat, any true knight would not fight that way. But it was very important that somebody had to do it. And so that created an economic opening for a highly professionalized class of siege engineers who by and large were commoners. And the thing that's really interesting is that this was a disreputable profession. And so as a result, there was no guild for it. You just kind of had to do it. And there's another economic circumstance which further accelerated this professionalization, which was that the Middle Ages were a pretty violent time. But a really big siege would only happen in one given spot, like maybe once every 20 years at most. But if there's a really big siege happening, you want the best of the best on your side, right? You want the guy who's done this hundreds of times before and knows all the tricks. But what that meant was that the best siege engineers were mercenaries who would go from war to war and from siege to siege, selling their services to the highest bidder. And so it became a very professionalized profession with absolutely no barriers to entry. These guys basically lived off of their reputations, and they developed all kinds of hilarious rivalries. Like there's a lot of really interesting stuff here. I read about one guy who basically just developed a grudge with another siege engineer and specialized in only knocking down his castles. And over time, like it really became a profession. You can tell because they developed professional jargon, which is the first sign that something's become a technical profession. And it got to be a very big business. So in the Siege of Rhodes by the Ottoman Turks in 1522, it's estimated that there might have been up to 1 million people on both sides of this siege. Imagine how much money it would cost to feed and supply and arm 1 million people for the duration of a siege. Think about what percentage of the GDP of a medieval or early modern country that would be. And now imagine how valuable it would be if you could hire a guy who would increase your chances of winning by like a few percentage points. These guys made crazy amounts of money if they were good. The very best ones made so much money that they were able to buy titles of nobility and move their entire family into the aristocracy, which was a very, very rare thing back then. Okay, so let's talk about some pros and cons of being a siege engineer compared to being in a guild. On the plus side, you can make a lot of money. You can also use any technique so long as it works. I think this is like a very, very important kind of intellectual freedom. The only thing that matters in a siege is winning, right? And so if you think the way everybody else does something is stupid and you develop a new approach that works, your boss is happy, right? It's good, you won. There's no barrier to entry. As I said, there's no guild of siege engineers. You can just wake up one day and do this. And if you're good at it, your reputation will spread and you'll be able to do it more and more. On the bad side, there is no safety net. If you're not good at it, that's it. You're not going to get any work. And if you just get unlucky and there's no wars for a few decades that happen to intersect with your career, sorry, you're not going to get any work at all. You have unpredictable work hours, right? So when you're doing your downtime and you're back in your studying new kinds of, siege equipment or whatever, maybe your work hours are pretty reasonable, but when you're actually at a siege, you're working 24/7. You're basically not sleeping while that siege is happening. And then you might die. The Middle Ages were a dangerous time, and sieges especially were dangerous places, both for the attacker and the defender. Okay, so you're all rolling your eyes, and you're like, Will, I know exactly what you're doing. You're not talking about guilds and siege engineers. You're talking about academia and industry, but I'm actually not. This is a very bad comparison. Look at it for a second, right? I do think it's true that academia is a guild, and that it has many of the same pros and cons as guild membership, but industry is not like being a siege engineer at all, right? Like there's tons of barriers to entry in industry. They're like the work hours. I mean, Laszlo, tell us, right? Like at Google, they're very reasonable. Like people come in at 9, 10 a.m. It's like easy. Like, you're very unlikely to die, I promise you. So what am I doing here? Why am I talking about siege engineers? I will get right back to it. But in the meantime, let's do a more fair, more honest comparison of academia and industry. I think we're going to find something interesting. So I think this is kind of how I would rank them. Basically, it is true you make a lot more money in industry than in academia. I think they're actually roughly equally good on your ability to work on what you want. This is not a very widely acknowledged fact, but I think it's true. When you're an academic, when you're like a grad student or a postdoc, you're pretty much doing what other people say with a little bit of influence. And then when you have tenure, you can kind of work on anything you want. The thing that's not very well known is that industry is basically the same. When you come in as a junior researcher, you have to do what other people say. By the time you reach a level of seniority that's equivalent to having tenure, you can basically work on whatever you want. The place where I think academia really clearly wins is this quality that I'm going to call focus. Maybe predictability is a better word. I don't have a great word for it. Let me give you an example of what I mean. A thing that happens sometimes when you're working in a big industrial research lab, ask me over beers sometime about this, is, two VPs fight like 10 levels above you for some inscrutable reason. And as a result, your entire project gets canceled. Or the company decides to change its strategic focus and suddenly you're not allowed to work on that thing anymore. It's really annoying when it happens. And it happens basically the bigger the organization you work at, the harder it is to see this coming and the more unpredictable and chaotic this can be. And that's a little bit paradoxical, but it's actually very true because the bigger a company, the more complex its internal hierarchy and the harder it is for you to model or to know that you have adequate political coverage. I'm only giving academia 2 stars for this quality though, because I think academics also get a little bit limited in the kinds of projects that they can take on. Basically, academia is a little bit limited in the duration and the scope of work they can do by the length of time it takes somebody to complete a PhD, right? If there's a research program that you want to do in academia and it will take 3 people working on it for 7 years, that is a very hard project to accomplish. And that is a limitation that I think we often don't think about, but that is really there. Okay, so whenever I look at any sort of comparison like this, maybe it's 2 data structures with different asymptotics or whatever, I always want to know, like, is there another option? Is there some other thing we can do? And I think there is. And I think it's an option that many academics aren't as familiar with for very good historical reasons. And the historical reasons, they all have to do with what do academics think of when they think of industry. And I think they basically think of this. This is a picture of Fairchild Semiconductor. I could have given you a picture of Bell Labs. What these things all have in common is they have their roots in the 1950s, when the US government, in order to try to win the Cold War, pumped money into research universities and defense contractors, because those were the organizations that were going to deliver the technological might that would enable us to defeat the Soviet Union. So over time, like, these universities and defense contractors developed many interconnections and relationships. And then as time went on, the kind of company changed, it broadened. It included things like Bell and 3M and Xerox and so on. But it was still these very, very big companies with an industrial heritage and a research lab on the side. And then as time went further on, it's now Google and Microsoft and Amazon and Uber, but it's still very big companies with an industrial research arm. And, and that's kind of what academics think of. And my evidence for this is just go read some conference proceedings, right? I'm more of a SIGMOD kind of guy. So this is SIGMOD accepted papers from this year. And what do we see? Microsoft, Uber, Microsoft, Alibaba, Microsoft, Amazon, right? That's who's there. This is pretty much what I expect. This is not that shocking. These are the companies that come to academic conferences. And so they're the companies that academics are aware of. But the thing is, there are other companies that are doing very interesting, very fundamental, speculative research. And that is because some very important things have changed since the 1950s. The first thing that has changed is, what we do is not actually very expensive anymore. Research, especially computer science research. We're not quite at the level of mathematics, where all you have to do is pay for researchers' salaries and chalk and coffee, but it's not the Large Hadron Collider either. To do interesting fundamental research in computer science, you need to pay researchers and buy them computers. And computers are very cheap. If you're doing distributed systems or fuzzing research, you may have to buy a lot of computers. Guess what? A lot of computers is still very cheap. The most capital intensive kind of computer science research happening these days is probably research in AI pre-training. And even that is largely being done by quite small, quite capital constrained organizations. Because guess what? Even GPUs are very cheap in the scheme of things. So that's one really important effect. The other really important thing that has happened is the zero interest rate policy. So starting in 2008, after the financial crisis, many central banks around the world all cut their interest rates to zero and then left them there for a very long time. That has two really important effects on startups in particular. The first is that the interest rate that you get from the central bank via sort of complicated mechanisms that actually economists don't understand very well, has effects on all the other interest rates in the economy. And in particular on the rate of return for risk-free assets, which also gets very close to zero. The thing is that there are certain kinds of investors, especially institutional investors, especially things like pension funds, which can have statutory requirements that they need to get a particular rate of return. And so all of these institutional investors started chasing riskier and riskier investments in order to get that rate of return, and many of them began pouring their money into startups. The other thing that has happened is actually even more important, which is it has changed the payoff calculus. So this is the formula for the net present value of future money, basically. And the variable I in this formula is the interest rate. And so you can see that when the interest rate gets very, very close to zero, this formula acts like a time machine, which makes money being realized in the far future almost as valuable as money today. What that means is that all of a sudden it is economically rational to fund a company whose entire purpose, whose entire reason for existence is that it's going to lose money for years and years and years and years and years, and then finally make money sometime in the future, right? Suddenly that becomes reasonable. For example, a company that's going to do some difficult fundamental research and then at the end realize some benefit from it. So it's now economically rational to fund that kind of company when interest rates are very low. At the same time, all of these institutional investors are seeking higher rates of return, pouring their money into the sector. The result was an explosion of startups beginning in the early 2010s, which were doing very interesting, low-level, fundamental, high-risk computer science research. So let me tell you a little bit about what it's like to be a researcher at one of these startups. The amount of money you make is kind of in between academia and Google. They are completely standout on this focus or predictability quality. And I think this is something that is not sufficiently well appreciated, right? Startups sound like they would be very dangerous, very unstable. If you've watched, Silicon Valley sitcom on HBO, it's like they're pivoting every 5 minutes. But no. Like in real life, this kind of startup, if you've made a bet, right, and your bet is that you will make money in the far future after you solve some kind of research problem, that is the entire purpose of your company. There's nothing else that you can do. No strategic change or argument between VPs is going to change the fact that you have to do that research to make your money. The thing you have to worry about is the entire company running out of money and going bankrupt and going under. And that is a risk, but it happens on a longer time scale than the average strategic shift in a big company. The flip side of that exact same quality, though, is that startups are the very worst when it comes to being able to work on what you want. And it's because of the same reason. If you are just working, if there's one research problem, which the solution to that problem is what will make or break your company, you just have to only work on that problem. You're not allowed to get interested in something else or get distracted or decide to change your research focus. And so that's probably the biggest bummer, the biggest downside for people who want to do research. Okay, so this is all very theoretical. I want to tell you about two particular startups that have done some interesting research. I could tell you about thousands of them, especially these days with all the AI companies. I'm just going to tell you about two of them that I worked at because those are the ones that I know the best. The first one is this company called FoundationDB. So FoundationDB was a company founded in response to a particular research question. And the fundamental research question had to do with a theorem in academic computer science called the CAP theorem. Those of you who know a little bit of distributed systems theory may have heard of this. The CAP theorem was proved by a pair of academics named Gilbert and Lynch at MIT. And it basically was interpreted to impose very, very harsh trade-offs on the kinds of distributed systems, and in particular, the kinds of distributed databases that could be built. And everybody had a single interpretation of that theorem, which said that this trade-off was real. And as a consequence of that monoculture, a lot of very, very bad databases were built, in our opinion. And so this company was founded with one research question, which is, what if that interpretation of that theorem is wrong? And because we were a startup, we didn't have to convince some grant-making body, and we didn't have to convince some VP at Google to let us do this. We could just go raise money from investors and raise enough money that a large team of people could just all work together for 5 years to try and prove this theorem wrong, or this interpretation of the theorem wrong. And guess what? We were correct. And we made a database that completely bypassed this trade-off. And it's been very influential on the industry ever since. And now many people have copied us, and it's great. I don't think we could have done that in academia. And many other large industrial labs tried to do that. Only one of them succeeded. It was at Google. But Apple failed. That's why they bought us. Amazon failed. Microsoft failed. But a startup succeeded. Along the way, we actually did another pretty interesting piece of low-level research. We invented a completely new way of testing. This has also since become quite influential in the broader world. This technique was called deterministic simulation testing. The idea is you have some large distributed system, which you want to have be very fault tolerant and in response to weird network timings or weird situations or whatever. So what you do is you build a single-threaded, event-driven network simulation of your distributed system, which is entirely deterministic, and then you basically fuzz the simulation. And you look and see if you can get the simulation into any interesting states. If you do, that's probably also a bug in your real system. And you can also now debug it deterministically because your simulation runs in a single thread. And this could have been somebody's PhD dissertation, right? But it wasn't. It was like a thing. It was even like a side project of the startup that we were doing that did something else. So that's cool. Our current startup is actually a little bit of a successor to this idea. And it has also been founded in response to a fundamental research question, which I think the people in this room should care about, which is, why is it that nobody fuzzes their software, right? Like, fuzzing is great. Fuzzing finds so many important bugs. Fuzzing finds security bugs. It finds memory leaks. It finds business logic problems. If, as I do, you consider fuzzing to be a subset of property-based testing, then fuzzing finds like every bug, right? And yet, to a first-order approximation, 0% of software is fuzzed. That should be very disturbing to all of us. It's very disturbing to me. And so, again, we started this company and raised a bunch of money to go and figure out the answer to this question. Why is 0% approximately of software fuzzed? So I think we got some answers. Basically, our conclusion was it's because the vast majority of software does not actually benefit from the killer benefits of fuzzing. Like, fuzzing is so good in the domain of software that it works well on, but that domain is surprisingly small and surprisingly constrained. And let me give you an example, but that problem is solved. And let me give you an example concretely of what I mean. So this is an example from distributed systems, because that's what I know about. The reason why distributed systems are awful, why it's like the worst part of programming and of computer science, is basically all your bugs look like this, right? You need 3 rare events happening in a particular order, and each of them is quite rare, and they're all independent of each other. And if that exact sequence occurs, then something awful happens, right? In this case, I have 3 events: a leader election, a transaction rolling back, and a failover. They each have a 1 in 1,000 chance. Since they're independent, that means my odds of seeing all 3 of them in this order is 1 in a billion. 1 in a billion means my tests will never catch this bug. But 1 in a billion is not very rare. If you're Google scale or your Facebook scale, 1 in a billion will happen every day. But it will be so hard to debug and so hard to catch, so hard to spot it in the act. And if this 1 in a billion bug leads to something really bad, like customer data corruption, which almost all distributed systems bugs do, then your life will be ruined by this bug. So I mentioned this bug because this, if you think about it, is the kind of situation that fuzzing should crush, right? If you have a fuzzer, a coverage guided one like AFL, right? What's it supposed to do? This leader election, presumably some new code runs. So I fuzz for a while, I hit the leader election, I add the input that generated that leader election to my corpus, I continue fuzzing. Like this, obviously this 1 in 3,000 model is drastically oversimplified, but like asymptotically, it's correct. I get like an nth root speed up where n is the number of incremental things where I got some new coverage that led to the bug. Like fuzzing is supposed to totally solve this problem. Fuzzing does not solve this problem. Like nobody fuzzes distributed databases. Why is that? Well, it's because this totally doesn't work. If I have some input which triggers the leader election, this is not a file format parser. Like feeding that same input in again will probably not trigger the leader election because there's so many external environmental sources of non-determinism. Things like the exact timing of network delivery of packets, or like the order in which the operating system chose to schedule some threads or whatever. And so basically what that means is that fuzzing doesn't actually get me an asymptotic speed up here, and it doesn't move me enough that I want to build some harness and actually go and do this, right? And the problem is the vast, vast majority of software in the world looks more like this. It gets random numbers. It, chalks over the network. It's large collections of microservices. It's highly concurrent, highly threaded applications. And all of it resists fuzzing because this suddenly stops working very well. So the question then is, can we solve that problem in a fundamental way? And so we set off and did a little bit of research and decided that yes, actually we could. All we had to do was build a deterministic computer. So that's what we did. Basically, it's a hypervisor. And what it does is it can run any collection of software on any operating system fully deterministically and turn it into a pure function, right? So this is our hypervisor booting Ubuntu twice and getting the exact same hash of all of the memory on the inside both times. And it can do this not just with Ubuntu, but with anything. What that means is that now I can take arbitrary collections of software, all the stuff that people don't fuzz today, things like distributed databases, things like random piles of microservices, things like computer games, and I can put them in the hypervisor, and now suddenly they're a target that's highly amenable to fuzzing. And I have expanded the universe of things that can be fuzzed. There's another benefit to this, which is many of these programs, like if you think about traditional fuzzing targets, things like parsers or command line utilities, they all have kind of the same shape with respect to their IO, right? They take a bunch of input from the, from the harness or whatever, and then they do a bunch of computation, and then they give an answer or they crash. But again, most software in the world is like interactive. It like gets some input, it like does some computation, it like does some more IO, it gets some more computation, right? Like games, web servers, all these things behave like that. Time is an important component to them. And that's part of how this non-determinism creeps in. But that defeats another huge benefit of fuzzing. Like a huge benefit of fuzzing is that you get concrete failures. Like you get clear, like you get a counterexample that actually crashes your program or actually makes it do something wrong. And then you can run that through again and again, like with, and run it under a debugger or whatever. And it's like very powerful, right? Static analysis does not have this property. I think it's one reason why fuzzing is so successful in the domain where it does get used. But we actually get that back from the hypervisor, right? Now we can like not only give you a concrete repo in your process, we can actually do time travel debugging on the entire operating system and the state of the whole operating system. So here with fuzzing, we found a crash in Apache Kafka. And what we can do is just rewind time because we have a fully deterministic system and attach TCP dump and look at the network traffic from the moment before the crash occurred, right? So we've gotten the debuggability of classical fuzzing, and we've now brought it also to this expanded universe. We can also do other kinds of things. Like if the passage of time is a critical component to something crashing, then we can look at how the passage of time and which inputs we've delivered so far affects the probability of the bug. So this graph is produced, basically the top right point is the moment that the bug happened, right? And at that moment, the odds of the bug are 100%. And then we just rewind time a second and we turn off all the intelligence in our fuzzer and run, a few thousand inputs in. And we measure the percentage of them that still hit the crash. Then we rewind 2 seconds and do the same thing, and rewind 3 seconds and still do the same thing. And now we have the causal history of the bug. We have the structure, the empirically measured probability of the bug hitting at different moments in time, which for a system like a distributed database, where packets are moving from place to place, or like a computer game where the user is taking actions, like time and when you did the action could have a huge effect. And now we can look at the moments where the probability is increasing most quickly and look at which inputs we were providing then, or what the system was doing then, what lines of coverage were running then. And so we've basically taken the debuggability of classic fuzzing and again, given it a huge upgrade. The third reason that I think fuzzing has not taken over the world yet, and that we are now trying to solve, and it's a hard research problem, and maybe you all can help us, has to do with state space exploration. So how many of you have seen this blog post? Yeah, it's so good. So this was super, super influential on me. This is from the creator of AFL. And I still go back and I read this post once a year because I think it's basically a miracle. What he showed is you can take AFL and you can point it at a JPEG parser with nothing at all in its corpus. And you turn it on and you walk away for a few hours. And when you come back, it's produced JPEGs. And I think for those of us who've been fuzzing for a long time, maybe we forget what a miracle that is. The total number of possible sequences of bytes that you could feed to a JPEG parser is 256 raised to the number of inputs. It's an astronomical number. And the fraction of those that is a valid JPEG is so infinitesimal. And yet AFL can find this infinitely small needle in this infinitely large haystack in a few hours. It's so crazy and it's so cool. And I think that this is another big part of why fuzzing has taken over where it has taken over. The really bad news, the thing that we learned, which, didn't have to be true, but it turns out to be, is that incredible efficiency at state space exploration based on coverage heuristics works really well when you're fuzzing parsers, and it works really well when you're fuzzing command line utilities. But when you have a fully deterministic computing environment and you expand the range of software that can be fuzzed, it turns out that heuristic falls apart. And this is not necessarily very intuitively surprising, right? If you think about a distributed system, which lines of coverage have run is much less interesting than what order they've run on different nodes of the system. If you think about fuzzing a computer game, imagine fuzzing Super Mario Brothers. You turn the game on, basically all the code runs. And then basically nothing new and interesting happens from a coverage point of view until you beat the first level. And that is a much, much too sparse signal for the fuzzer to actually make progress towards its goal. Now, it is true that there's a paper where some people have used a fuzzer to play Super Mario Brothers, but number one, they cheated. And number two, I think it's very, very noteworthy that they did not take those techniques and apply them to more complicated games, like for instance, The Legend of Zelda. So here is our fuzzer fully exploring and beating The Legend of Zelda. And we did this via a combination of techniques, and we've had many research projects in this direction, some of them higher risk than others. We've tried to basically find other heuristics besides just pure branch coverage that works better when you move into this larger universe of programs with more general properties. And we've also tried some very, very ambitious approaches where we learn particular heuristics for particular programs as we are fuzzing them using techniques from machine learning. This is all still very much a work in progress. But again, we, a tiny startup, are able to do this because we are able to argue very convincingly, because it's true, to investors that if we can solve this problem, there's a giant pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And so they're happy to fund this research because it's going to be economically valuable someday. So, right, I want to end by telling you about the fourth path. So basically, if the big downside of being a researcher at a startup is this middle one, where you're not able to work on what you want, there is a very simple solution to that problem, which is you just start your own company. And now you're definitionally working on what you want. And this is the true siege engineer option. This has a payoff matrix and a list of pros and cons much more similar to being a medieval siege engineer, with one very, very important difference, which is that you're still quite unlikely to die. Starting a company can be risky in some ways, and it can be very stressful in some ways. But in terms of how dangerous an activity it is compared to the amount of upside that you could realize, it is better than any opportunity any of our ancestors ever had access to, right? It is not sailing off to America on a boat. Like, it is not going and joining a siege. Like, it is not going and joining a steppe horde if you're a Mongolian, right? Like, it's really very safe compared to all of those activities, but similarly has the potential to give you something really, really great. And these days, it's actually quite easy to get started. So if any of you have questions or want to learn more about what it is like to try to convince investors that no, really, your computer science research could lead to something amazing in the future and they should give you money, I am happy to tell you all about it. I'm going to be here for the rest of the day. This is my email address. Feel free to email me as well. Thank you all so much.